Hey guys, Crit here. For today, we're talking about something that I actually haven't talked about in a while, and that is what augments to go for in PSO2 New Genesis and how to obtain them. For today, I'm going to assume that you already know how augmenting works and what the stats are like in New Genesis, but if you don't know and you're a brand new player, I do have some other videos and resources that you can check out down below. But as we go for today, we're going to be going into different categories based off of what these capsules or augments cost in the player market. This is usually a good indicator of how much supply there are of these augments and how easy they are to obtain in the game. But I have this split up into 4 categories this time instead of just 3. First is the cheap category, which is you get these augments either through free means in the game, or it costs up to like 10,000 meseta in the player shop, which is very affordable. But for the next one, it's mid-range augments. These are a little bit better typically, and they cost between 10,000 to 100,000 meseta per capsule. And then there's the higher range ones, which starts getting a little bit pricey, between 100,000 to 1 mil per capsule. And then hyper expensive augments that are a mil plus, that are usually the top of the line augments within the game. For each of these, I'll be doing example builds using the augments within those ranges, or anything from before in lower ranges if they're still useful at that point. And then also, this isn't an extensive list of every augment within the game, only ones that I think that you should be actually using or consider using depending on what kind of build that you want to do. Let's finally start though with the cheap category. This is where most of the augments are within the game, but the vast majority of those are garbage or useless because they're just better options which are also within this range. So I narrowed it down to those good ones, and this is where a good starting point is at for you if you're getting towards like the end game, like around level 65. 85, but you can also get these augments even earlier than that if you want to use it on earlier gear to accelerate even faster. Getting into it, we're actually going to start off with several augments at once called LC augments. So these are technically not buyable in the player market and you have to earn them for yourself, but they're so readily available in almost all of the endgame content and even in other exchanges within the game that you'll just have a ton of these anyways. But the vast majority of these are good, like Gladius Soul LC, that's 3.5% potency, Gigas Mass Day LC, 3.25%, Hell Finale LC, 3.75%, and then just so on and so forth with all these with a ton of different substats that it just is going to build up very nicely for a beginner build. These are all actually based off of other augments within the game that have the same name, just not the LC attached to it. And the only difference between these and the original counterparts is 0.25% potency. These are just a little bit under those, but way easier to obtain. And you can find all of these in the Lucille Exploration, Time Extension missions, Urgent Quests, which can all be found in the quest counter, the Gorge with the Ancients and Caveris, Limited Time Quests. You can actually exchange for some of these with Growth Mint, which can also be found in Lucille or other means. And also they added these LCs recently to the Genesis Point Exchange, which is super easy to get, and I highly recommend getting these out of there if you need to start building these up. The reason I say that is that the LC augments in here only cost 100 GP each, and you can get 1250 a day just by going into people's creative spaces, collecting from their GP trees. That means 12 of these a day that you can do at the very start of playing this game. So if you're at a loss of where to start with augments, these are a great point to look at. And I imagine as time goes on, there'll be more LC augments added, because that's what they've been doing already, because High Red Domina and Grand Dreadkeeper LC were not added until later after the first batch. But now let's finally move on into the rest of the cheap category, where I think these are good alternatives, or are even better in certain cases over some of these LC augments. So going into the next one, we have Stat 4. These are Might 4, Precision 4, and Technique 4. These are ones that are specific potencies, so like Technique, Range, or Melee. So you can only use them for certain weapons, but they're a good, solid 3% potency, so just extra damage. These are easily obtainable in a lot of the content within the game, even some early content, but you can also find them in the Genesis Point Exchange for even cheaper than the LC ones. Next, there are Soul 4s, which there are a ton of those. There's just a few examples here, but generally they are 3% potency of some kind or multiple kinds, and they have different substats like HP and photon points. But for these, you can find them from level 60 plus bosses, urgent quests. The Aegis Integra Exchange can give you Aegis Soul 4s, which I don't know if you necessarily want to use it for augmenting because they are used as material, but you can if you want to. There's also some in the Genesis Point Exchange as well, which are also cheaper than LC augments. Then we have the Dreadkeeper 4. This is our first tanky augment versus a DPS one. because this one gives a ton of HP and damage resistance and even some photon points, but it doesn't give any potency. It only gives potency floor, which it does raise your minimum damage that you can do, so it is a little bit helpful towards DPS, but doesn't raise the maximum damage that you could do. Typically, you obtain this from veteran/dread enemies out in the open worlds, and they need to be at least level 60 to be able to get the level 4 version of this. It can also be crafted in the item lab using lesser Dreadkeepers, like Dreadkeeper 3s, Photon Quartz, and then Pentalite all combined together to make one of these. Then you also can find it dropping in the GeoLab rank 2 version sometimes. You can find this augment in the GP Exchange. The GP Exchange, just from what I've seen, has been a great way to get a lot of these beginner augments just for free every single day. Then we have the Triple-2. Normally, you can only craft this in the item lab, getting a Fermito Fuchsia from Dual Quest Phase 1 at the quest counter, and then using 5 of each Doable 4 on top of that to make just one of these Triple-2s, which is basically the same as a Stat 4, just has generic potency, which can be used for any weapon instead of just a specific one. But the reason why it's down this low and I recommend it is because you can get it for free in the mission pass and get quite a bit of them. And then because it's free to everybody that way, a lot of them are just in the player market for 1,000 meseta a pop, so you can get this super cheap as well. For the last set of cheap augments, these have a lot of potency, but they do come with big drawbacks, and these are Trial augments. There's 3 different kinds right now. They have Guaro Trial, which has 3.5% potency, then minus 5% damage resistance, Spiro Trial with minus 5 photon points, but that also has 3.5% potency, and then Wardrow has that 3.5% potency, and minus 50% all down resistance, or negative resistance towards elemental effects. So these are for people that want to get a lot of damage, but at the cost of other stats, giving them these negatives, but also not getting any positives like the other augments, so it's kind of like a double whammy. And the only way to currently obtain these in permanent content is time extension quests. You can get like 1 or 2 of those per run, but the best way used to be limited content that I believe will return at some point, called the Crimson Realm, which changes up certain combat zones, adding a Dry Varus boss trial, and then killing this Dry Varus boss, or at least hurting it enough, can give you a good amount of these trial augments. And what's special about these is that you can actually put all 3 of these on one piece of gear. For some reason, even though that they're named the same, they're considered different categories of augments. So you can have the Guaro, Spiro, and Wardrow on one piece of armor or on your weapon, whatever that you want to do. That is all of the cheap augments, though. There's a good variety there. There are some conflicts, so you can't have the high Ale Domina and the high Rent Domina LC augments on one piece of gear, but you can like intermingle, like having high Rent on one piece and high Ale on another piece. Same with the Grand Dread LC and Dreadkeeper 4. Those are considered the same category of augments. You just got to be careful there in terms of planning out your gear. But for an example build that is pretty good, I would go with the Half Finale LC at 3.75% potency, Gladius Soul LC, Gigas Maste LC, High El Domina LC, Grand Dreadkeeper LC, and the Triple-2. Those all put together on a single piece of equipment would be a total of 20% potency, not 18.5% because it's all multiplicative instead of additive. You can see the math for this at the bottom of the slide down below if you care to see that. But all in total, if you did this 4 different times for, 1 for the weapon, 3 for the different armors, then it would come out with a 107% potency in total with just the augments alone. If, for example, you had the Ainea armor on, the current best in slot armor, which is actually really easy to obtain either by buying it in the player market or getting it to drop, you actually get a total of about 143.3% potency, which is a pretty good baseline to start off with. You honestly don't have to be at this number right away, but within like the first week of getting into the end game, you should be around that. Also at level 65, they give you some pre-upgraded equipment called the Argenti weapon and Aptistant armor that when equipped just as is, it has a whole bunch of pre-upgrades on it, including some of those augments that put together, it gives you 130% potency about. So if anything, you should be at least at that number, working your way towards something like this. Now though, let's move into the mid-range augments. There actually isn't a ton within this 10,000 to 100,000 range right now, but I wanted to keep it separate because it's going to bring up some interesting points once we get into the example builds that I'll be showing within this category. But for the first augment, we have Mastery 4. This is the better version of the Mastery LC. It just has a little bit more potency. Yeah, for this augment, it's like an all-arounder with 2.5% potency, 2.5% potency floor, and 2.5% damage resistance. So it's pretty nice there, but it isn't like really great for those that just love going into damage exclusively. When it comes to this thing's pricing, it's a bit of a weird one because it has a low supply, but it also doesn't have a high demand. So it's just been sitting in this weird limbo where there isn't too much being injected into the market, but there isn't really many people going after this either, because with how you get this augment, it only drops from captains, which are a rare trial in combat zones or exploration zones. It has to be at least level 60 to drop a Mastery 4, but it typically drops the lower versions, which then you can upgrade into the 4, but that takes quite a bit of them. And then sometimes you can get it in dual quests, like any of the phases. It can be a rare drop in there, but you'd have to farm up like a ton of those dual quests to even see one. And then sometimes it's available in seasonal events or limited time content as just like a set of 10 or something like that for each player. And for the demand side of things, the only reason to really go for this is for its extra damage resistance for those that care about it. A lot of the players within NGS like to go for more damage, or at least a balance of it, not caring too much leaning into tankiness. So they want like the LC augments, skipping over the Mastery LC, instead using some of the other cheap augments that I mentioned earlier. Then I believe for those that go towards being tanky, but maybe not all the way into it, would instead opt for another augment within this range, the Dreadkeeper 5, because this gives 60 HP and 3.5% damage resistance, which is more towards being tanky than the Mastery 4, but then it also gives 8% potency floor, which is still a good amount towards your DPS, and then 12 photon points, so a good boost in a lot of stats. And these can be obtained easier than the Mastery 4 with killing veteran and dread enemies, as long as they're 80 plus in the exploration zones. And then it can also be crafted with lower tiers of Dreadkeeper, like 30 Dreadkeeper 4s, 30 Photon Quartz, and 30 Hexakites. So far, it's only been tanky augments in the mid-range, but what about something else? Well, there are these Gigas 4s, but I recommend not using them because of what was shown in the cheap augment section. So these Gigas 4s, Gigas Might 4, Precision 4, and Technique 4 are basically the same as some of the cheap augments in terms of having 3% potency for a single type, but these just have 20 HP on top. The reason why these are in the mid-range right now, though, are because you can use them to craft a higher augment that we'll talk about later, called Gigas Maste. You can also use it to craft Gigas Euphroy, Agli, and Thali 2s, which we'll also talk about later. But you can obtain these Gigas 4s from Gigantics that are level 69 plus in Purple Battle Dias, Recon Gigants, and you can also use Gigas Strugments, which you can get from those Gigantics too, in exchange for these straight up. Like I said though, don't use them for augmenting, use them for crafting other augments in the future. But that's it for the mid-range of augments. There isn't too much there. A lot of the other augments that are the best ones to use or the better ones to use just get way more expensive because a lot of people want those augments. So these ones are just sitting oddly in the middle. And because of that, I want to do some different example builds that we didn't really show in the cheap section. So there's a DPS build using the Trial augments and then some of the LCs from before, the better ones there, just to get the max amount of potency that we can. And then we'll also do an example build with the tanky capsules that we just saw in this mid-range. But with this DPS build, all this combined together with the Trials and these LCs, you get 22.9% potency on a single gear piece. Do keep in mind though, this is without a ton of different substats that you would normally see with like some other augments, and there's actually no floor potency at all with this build. But altogether, you get 128.3% potency with just the augments alone, which is actually pretty significant. And then with the Anya armor stuff with the 5.5% from those for each piece, you get 168.1% potency, which that's actually quite high for actually a relatively cheap build. Let's continue though into the tank builds. So this is using the same kind of augments, but instead of the Trials, we're going to be using Hyret Domina LC, Mastery 4, and Dreadkeeper 5. So this is going to give us a lot of damage resistance and a lot of lore potency. So because of that, though, we're kind of losing out on quite a bit of potency. And then for a single piece of gear, if you had all of this together, it would only be 16.8% potency per piece. So that in total, if you were to copy that on all 4 pieces, would only be 85% potency with augments alone. And then with Anya armor, that's only 118.3%, which is even lower than what the first build was, but it's more expensive. So now the question is, was the sacrifice of all that potency worth it for extra damage resistance and floor potency that this build has versus the other two builds? Well, for the damage resistance, you get 21.63% in total from the augments alone. So that means you're taking 21.63% less damage from any attack that's hitting you. Not 26% though, because it isn't additive, it's multiplicative, kind of like potency, but it's in a different way, where it's diminishing returns instead of increasing returns. Otherwise, if you somehow get to 100% damage resistance, you'd be taking absolutely 0 damage, which SEGA can't let you do that. But yeah, the math for it is all right here if you care about that, if you want to take a look at it and pause real quick. I'm not going to explain it right now, but how does it look with the DPS build that we just looked at? Well, as we know with the Guaro Trial, it had -5% damage resistance for each one that you had. So if you had 4 of those in total, you'd have -21.55% in total from just those augments. So that's actually about a 42-43% difference between the tank build and the DPS build. And that is huge. That can mean life or death in quite a few scenarios. Let's also take a look at the floor potency situation, because the tank build does have quite a bit, as you see with all the math right here. But for the DPS build, it had no floor whatsoever, so it just has the flat variance or the regular range of 50% to 100% for its damage. What that basically means is that sometimes you're going to be doing half damage, sometimes you're going to be doing your full damage, or any number in between. With the tank build, though, you're going to be doing between 82% to 100%. That's a much shorter range, so it's more consistent. So right now it looks pretty good for the tank build, but now let's take into account the potencies of these into this range. So with the DPS build, like before, it had 168.1% potency with this variance, and then the tank build had 118.3% potency with 82 to 100% variance. So taking that into account, the range for the DPS build is 84.05, because that's half of what the 168.1% number is, up to that number. So it's quite a large range. You can go very low in terms of damage, but you can also get very high numbers of damage. So a lot of people like seeing that high number, so that's what quite a few people go for. But with the tank builds, you do have quite a bit higher minimum at 97.1, so that's about 13% higher, but it only gets up to that 118.3% number. So what is the better range? The one with the lower minimum but a way higher maximum, or the one that's a little bit more consistent but in between? Well, the damage range average for both of these is, with the DPS build, it's like 126, 127%, and with the tank build, it's only like 108%. So the DPS build still wins in terms of doing damage, but it isn't as high as what you think it would be. It's only difference about like 18%. That, of course, though, does not factor in critical hit rate or the amount of criticals that you'll be getting within the game. The way that crits work within NGS is that when you do so, it does the max damage within your range, plus added extra critical potency on top of that attack. And because the DPS build is the way that it is with a larger range, whenever you crit, it's making up for a larger difference hitting the maximum. And also because it does have a higher maximum, it's actually getting more multiplicative with that extra critical potency, more so than the tank build. What this means is that the more critical hit rate that you have, the larger that difference that I mentioned before of that 18% grows and grows. So it's no longer 18%, but it could be 25, 30, 40% difference in terms of its average if you have a large crit rate. So after all that, what would I choose out of the two builds? The tank one with the damage resistance and the high variance, or the DPS build with a lot of potential damage, but has a lot of drawbacks to it with the Trial Augments? Well, out of the two, I would choose neither, but both at the same time. I would actually choose to intermingle the two instead of going to both extremes. Basically fine-tuning to where I think would be a good point for how I play the game, where I want maybe some damage resistance, or maybe I would want a little bit more damage here or there, to where I would use, augments from both sides. I think it's just so interesting when you're at this point in the game with how wild the directions go in terms of augmenting But as you move forward with the more expensive augments, like getting into the high range ones, the game kind of makes the choice for you of making a more hybrid build of being both tanky and DPS oriented. To see what I mean, we can just go right into this range. With the first set of augments, we have fused triples. So there's 4 different kinds. We have the Sta, Spit, Deft, and Gua triple. These are basically triple 2s, but with extra substats attached to them. So this has HP, photon points. This one has a little bit less potency, but has potency floor. And then the Gua has extra damage resistance. Right off the bat, I can tell you the Deft one is probably the worst, but it's basically a worse Mastery 4 because it doesn't have the damage resistance, but the same stats with the other 2 things. Then the Gua triple, I think, is actually the best one because it gives a high damage resistance and still has good amount of potency. To make all these, though, like I said, it's in the item lab, and they need 3 Formido fusions, which come from the Dual Quest Phase 1. Then all of them need 10 of each respective fused stat. So the Sta triple, for instance, needs 10 Sta Might, 10 Sta Precision, and 10 Sta Technique to make it on top of that fuchsia up here. And then these can be gotten from just like a whole bunch of different quests and from Megalotics enemies. So you usually get a ton of those, and it's this that you really need to farm for. The reason these are so high priced is that it's basically just because people don't want to farm it in the first place because you need to do the dual phase 1. Which a lot of people just don't want to make a gear set for because the dual quests, at least phase 1 through 3, needed to have a set of Defi augmented gear to actually do them or do them in a fast time to start making these at a decent amount. So a lot of people just decided not to do that, and that's why the prices of these have stayed so high, because the supply is just low, but the demand is still there, at least for some of them. Next, we have the Hal Finale, which is one of the better augments for the longest time, which gives 15 HP, 5 photon points, and 4% potency. This can only be crafted, though, in the item lab at the moment, which needs 30 Aegis Soul 4s and 10 of each regular Domina, the Ale, Rent, Kvar, and Stira ones. But for all of these, they can be gotten through the Aegis Integra exchange, and with the Aegis Soul 4s, you can additionally get those in the Halfia Lake Urgent Quest guaranteed. For the other Domina stuff, though, this can be gotten through many means in the endgame right now. The more prominent one is probably Lucille Exploration. Then we have the Grand Dreadkeeper, which, just like the previous Hal Finale, is the original versions of the LC ones that we saw a while ago. So this has 15 HP, 3 photon points, 2.5% potency, 5% potency floor, and 1% damage resistance. So this is just a true all-arounder augment here. This also can only be crafted in the item lab with 10 Dreadkeeper 5s and 10 Orisis Fuchsias, which can only be gotten through dual phase 3. Then for the last set of augments within the high range, we have Gigas Agli, Euphroy, and Thali 2. These are some of the augments that I was mentioning with the Gigas 4s from earlier that need those as a component to make them. But these are a little bit higher in terms of potency than the Gigas 4s at 3.5%, and they are hybrid with their potency. So there are 2 kinds of types. The Thali is ranged and tech, the Agli is melee and ranged, and the Euphroy is melee and tech. And they all have 15 HP on top of that. Besides the Gigas 4s that all of these need, they also require 5 Formido Fuchsias from that dual phase 1 once again, and then 100 Megas Fuchsias from Megalotics enemies. That's quite a bit of those. The biggest component, though, is those Gigas 4s, which is going to vary depending on which one that you want to make. And that's all the recommended high-range augments. There's a decent amount there, a bit more than the mid-range. And for an example build that I would make with this, we have the Hal Finale augment, so we're replacing that LC finally. Gladius Soul LC still. Gigas Agli or Euphroy or Thali, depending on which kind of build that you're doing. And then High Ale Domina LC, the Gua triple, so that gives you the extra damage resistance and still that 3% potency. And then Grand Dreadkeeper with all those stats combined. But this put together gives 20.8% potency per piece of gear. And then if you're to copy this on all 4 pieces, you would get 113.3% potency with the augments alone, and then 150.5% with Ainita armor. So now that we have this could be much closer to what we saw with the mid DPS build. So there's the calculations from before with that. With the high builds, we have that 150.5, and then with the variants with the floor coming from the Grand Dread Keeper and the High El Domina, we have something like this. So then the damage range, as we saw before, is that with the mid DPS build with an average of 126. Then with the high build, we got a range of 99 to 150.5, with the average being 124.75. So not quite there, but very close. However, with the mid DPS build, it's not using anything like what the high build has with like the Hal Finale, which that mid DPS build could still use and still have the trials. Then also the Gigas Agli Euphroid Thali too. That would help out that mid DPS build a little bit. But then in the same token, this high range build could replace like the high L Dominant LC with one of those trials, or one of these other two with trials. It just, you can go back and forth, like I said before, where you can interchange some of the augments between, you know, high DPS and being tankier. But as we keep pushing forward with these augments, the trials are losing value, essentially, because it's getting closer in terms of potency, but all of these are still getting extra benefits with the extra stats of HP, PP, or damage resistance, and floor. But now let's finally get into the hyper-expensive augments. This is where the best of the best augments are. They take a lot of time to make, or a lot of resources, and basically everybody seeks these out because they have a lot of potency on them or a lot of other stats. So these are basically for the min-maxers, the 1%ers, or the whale players within the game. So first off, we have the Gigas Maste. This bumped up in price recently because of another thing that we'll talk about right after this augment, but this has 20 HP and 3.5% potency. It's almost exactly the same as the Agli, Thali, and Euphroid 2, but it has 5 more HP and it's generic potency instead of hybrid potency. But this can be crafted in the item lab just like those, but this takes 10 Fermito Fuchsias from Dual Phase 1, and then 10 of each of the Gigas 4 capsules. Honestly, when I look at this, it's probably better for you, if you're going to be at this level, to just make those hybrid Gigas capsules instead of making this to use it for your gear. The only reason you would make this nowadays is actually for the newest augment that's been added to the game, the Glan Gigas Maste. This is a huge jump in potency for the Gigas category. This has 30 HP and 4.75% potency. The best that we've seen so far today. But this can be also crafted in the item lab with 10 Magnif Fuchsias, which that is gotten from the Dual Phase 4 quest. Then you need 5 Gigas Mastes, and then 10 Foundia. The Foundia can be gotten from Starless Gigantic's bosses, and also the Genesis Point Exchange. Right now, because this is so new, this is omega expensive. I've seen it like 7-8 million just for a single one of these, which is at a 7% chance to be augmented onto your gear. So I wouldn't really worry about putting this on anything yet, unless if you have nothing else to do. But with the Dual Phase 4, this is actually better off than the other dual phases because they actually changed how this phase works in every phase that they're going to be adding moving forward, where you don't need a Defi augmented set of gear to actually like finish that quest. You can actually just go in with your normal set and clear it just fine and S-rank it for the max amount of fuchsias. Next, we actually have something similar to this, which is the Lux Hal Finale. This is an upgraded version of Hal Finale, which is the same as like Gigas Maste, the Glan Gigas Maste, where it takes multiple of Hal Finales and takes the Foundia, combines them together into a new thing. At least with this, you don't need to do a new dual quest, or any dual quest for that matter, for this augment. And getting the Hal Finales is actually easier than the Gigas Mastes, in my opinion, because you get a ton of free Aegis Soul 4s and Dominas from just the Aegis Integra exchange every single week. So you'll be actually able to get these over time, as long as you just do the bare minimum in terms of playing, just getting Genesis points, then turning it into Foundia or Aegis Integra, or just doing like one Halfia Lake UQ, getting an Aegis Integra that way with Astrians, turning that into that currency. Up next, we have the Gladius Soul. This is the final augment that requires you to do a dual quest Phase 2. And this gives 20 HP, 6 photon points, and 3.75% potency. I do imagine that this augment will be replaced soon, kind of like how the Gigas Maste got a Glan Gigas Maste, and the Hal Finale got a Lux Hal Finale. There's probably something akin to that for this augment coming soon, I would imagine. But this can only be crafted in the item lab with 10 Dual Fuses from the Dual Quest Phase 2, 10 Starro Souls, which are from Starless enemies just in general, and then 30 Errati Soul 4s. This is the reason why it's so expensive, because this is only available in the Dark Falls Interception Urgent Quest, and it's technically guaranteed in that quest, but you only get 3 every single time. You just gotta spam it over and over again. You can also sometimes get Errati Soul 4 in the Remnants of Ambition UQ, but it's much better to just do this quest instead of that one. Next, we have the High Dominas. There's 3 different kinds of these: the High Kaver, the High Ret, and the High Ale Domina. For all of these, they have 3% potency, but their potency floor and HP and photon points vary from each one. So the High Kaver is probably the better of the 3, at least in terms of DPS, because it has a little bit more floor than the rest of them, and then it has the photon points. But you can go for any of these depending on what kind of substats that you're really looking for. Like if you really want extra HP, then the High Red Domino might be for you. If you want a mix of stats, then the High Ale Domino might be for you. But all of these can be crafted in the item lab. It depends on which one that you're trying to craft, though, for the materials. So like the High Ale would need 30 Ale Sovereigns, and like the Ret would need 30 Ret Sovereigns, and then same with Kaver Sovereigns. And then for the other components, you need notes from all of the different combat zones within those areas. So the Ale is, of course, Aleo, Ret, Retem, and Kaver is Kaveris. So you need 100 of each note from the 3 combat zones in Aleo, 150 from both of the combat zones in Retem, and then 150 for both of the combat zones in Kaveris to make the respective dominas. These are probably one of the easier augments to make that's on the high end. It's just really tedious because of how many materials that you actually need. The sovereigns you can get from just farming the combat zones on the higher ranks when starless enemies appear in them. And then for the notes, you can just do that on any rank of those combat zones. You just need so many. It takes quite a while to build up that much just for a single augment for this. I do imagine eventually there will be a Stia version of this as well whenever we return to Stia, probably one last time. And then just like how Halfinale needs all of the regular dominas, there'll probably be some high Halfinale variant that will require all of the high dominas. Hopefully though, by that time, they'll make it easier to obtain these high dominas or easier to obtain the mats required to make these things. For the next slide, we have the last set of augments, the XD capsules. These are the pay-to-win augments currently within the game. They can only obtain from AC scratches or specifically support item select. The only other way besides this is by spending your meseta in the player market for somebody that did spend on one of those scratches and placed it in there. But these are decent augments to have right now. They're one of the best in slots that you can currently have. Specifically, the XD Deft Parfait is the best one towards DPS with 4% potency and 3% potency floor. The rest of them vary in terms of their substats, but they all have 4% potency of some kind, either hybrids or all potency if they're Parfait. And then their substats are going to depend on what kind of naming there is. So if there's Sta in it, it's going to have HP of some kind. If it has Spit, it's going to have photon points. And then all of them have potency floor of some kind, but it gets more if it has the deft attached to it. You can essentially just pick and choose what stats are on these things based on the naming of the augment. And of course, some of them are going to be more expensive, like the Deft Parfait, and then some of them cheaper, like these Ward XDs here, because they're just extra status ailment resistance that not a lot of people care about, at least not yet with the game. But these are limited in supply, and a support item select has not happened for quite some time. These are just getting more and more expensive. But do keep in mind with these, when you do get one of the capsules, it's 100% success rate. There's no chance of failure when you're augmenting these on your gear. So even if it's like several million, it might be worth more to you than some of those other augments that we mentioned, because this is a guarantee instead of like a 7 to 10% chance. I do want to mention though that I do think a new paid augment will happen soon with a different naming that's just going to be better, because they've already done that in the past. Like once new best in slots are happening that are better than the pay to win augment, they eventually make a new pay to win augment that's the best of the best again. Because now Lux Halfinale is surpassing this, Gland Gigas Maste is surpassing this, so I imagine there will be like a 5 or 5.5, even 6% potency capsule that we'll see with this pay-to-win support item select. Thankfully, though, you don't need to spend your meseta or real money on these augments to accomplish anything within the game. But yeah, that's all of the augments that I recommend right now. This is the whole list of the hyper expensive. There's actually quite a bit more than I would like to see in the 1 mil plus range, but they are very good augments. And with the kind of builds that I would make with this, is kind of like the best build that you can make right now. XD Def Parfait, of course, with the pay to win, if you were to use that. Lux Hal Finale with the 5%. Gland Giga Smash Day with the 4.75%. Gladius Soul with 3.75% potency. High Caveira Domino with the 3% potency and the 2.5% potency floor. And then the Grand Dreadkeeper with 2.5% potency and 5% floor. All that together gives you 25.3% potency per piece of gear. And then it totals out to 146.4% potency with the augments alone. And with Anya Armor, 189.4%. So with this, you can see this beats out that DPS build with the trials we were talking about a while ago by like 20% potency, but it's like way more expensive. So you gotta just justify getting that amount of potency, but also not having any drawbacks with the trials and having a whole bunch of positive stats with that. But speaking on the trials, you can actually include that within this kind of build. So you would actually replace the Grand Dreadkeeper and the High Caveira Domina because these trials have higher generic potency than those. And this would actually turn out to be 161.2% potency with just the augments and 206.7% potency with the Anya Armor, which is just absolutely insane. However, with that, I do want to see if this is actually better than the previous build when you actually incorporate the floor potency into the equation. So, taking a look at both of these, with Hyper DPS Build, the only floor potency that you're getting is from the XD augments, while the Balance Build is actually getting it from the XDs in addition to the Grand Dreadkeeper and the High Caveira Domina. So that brings it up by a good amount. So, with what we're getting with the ranges, the Hyper DPS gets 116.3 to 206.7, which averages out to 161.5. And with the balance builds, we actually get 143 to 189.4% with an average of 166.2. So the average is actually higher with the balance build, even though that the max potency is less in this case. With this in mind, now the Trial build can no longer just win outright in terms of DPS. It needs to actually fight in terms of critical hit rate, kind of like what we were mentioning earlier. So if we get more and more critical hit rate, then this average starts evening out, and then eventually the Hyper DPS build surpasses the Balance build in terms of average DPS. The instances on where you would see this is if you have a high Braver add-on skill in addition to like a Fatale 4 or Fatale 5 on your weapon, or if you're playing a Slayer main, then you might get close to it as long as you also have that Braver add-on skill leveled up. But even if you do pass that threshold with the critical hit rate, you gotta think to yourself, is it worth it to you to have a few extra percent of damage versus a whole bunch of stats like HP, photon points, and damage resistance on this side, and then also taking huge drawbacks with the Trial augments depending on which ones you choose. For that, I leave it up to you guys to decide for yourselves. Hopefully now, though, you've learned that there are many options when it comes to augmenting within New Genesis, and it even goes for the early game all the way up to the late game with the hyper expensive augments, as we just saw with the Trial ones. And also with that, potency is a high priority. It is important, but it's not just the sole focus, because there are many other stats to consider, just like damage resistance, because you don't want to die in a lot of the quests doing 0 damage. There's even some quests where there is a death limit, and also the stat that a lot of people don't consider, the all down resistance that a lot of people just fling to the wayside for status ailments. They've been more prevalent nowadays that I've noticed, like with this time extension quest, and then even with the teaser of the Lion Dark Falls coming in April, you may want to consider looking at those kind of stats now, and which ones are going to be influential to you. What kind of potency floor do you currently have or want to have? What critical hit rate do you have? What damage resistance do you want to aim for? What preset skills do you currently have that's going to influence what you're going to go for with your augments? Because you might have fix a guard already that gives you damage resistance, so you don't need as much from augments. You might have Fix a Fatale that's going to influence more the augments with the critical hit rate. And there's even the weird Abandak preset skill that you need different named augments to get more benefit out of, so that'll mess up the whole situation. And then you also got to consider, of course, the positives and negatives of taking some augments over others, or choosing some gear over other pieces of gear that would also change what augments that you want to shoot for. That is all that I have on this for today, though. There are other resources that I'll be linking in the description, including this presentation if you want it for later, or if you want to just take a look at it yourself. But let me know how I did today in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next NGS video. Peace.